Greetings. It is my pleasure to welcome each of you to this conversation today. My name is DeAndre Marshall, and I am the Director of Training and Programs for the International Human Trafficking Institute located here in Atlanta. As a convener of coalitions, the International Human Trafficking Institute is appreciative of the opportunity to join others to present a conversation on race, gender, and class, a cross-border discussion on the challenges and solutions to fighting trafficking of agricultural workers. You will have an opportunity to meet our guests shortly. I have the pleasure today of introducing the Miami Consul General, who will bring greetings to us. But before we do, I want to introduce Susan Harper. Prior to moving to Miami, Ms. Harper held two consecutive positions in global affairs, Canada in Ottawa, Director General and Senior Arctic Official and Director General, Trade Controls and Technical Barriers. She has been posted to the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C., where she became the Economic Minister. In addition to holding these prominent positions, Ms. Harper taught at both Cambrian College in Sudbury and George Brown College in Toronto. Please join me at this time in welcoming to our Zoom Miami Consul General Susan Harper.
Thank you so much, DeAndre. A pleasure to be with you, and that's quite an introduction. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome. Bienvenue. My colleague and the Acting Consul General of Canada in Atlanta, Kirk Dogood, and I would like to start by thanking all of you for joining us today in this important discussion on what is referred to as an invisible crime. It's a very timely event given that February 22nd marked Canada's first Human Trafficking Awareness Day. It's an important milestone because it joins the marketing efforts of the US and the international community in bringing greater profile to this crime and in mobilizing all areas of society to recognize it and to combat it. The idea for this panel started with our colleagues at the Consulate General of Canada at Atlanta. I'd like to give credit where credit is due. They've been working with their partners to share the experiences of human trafficking and to promote collaboration across borders to help put an end to this crime. We here in Florida thought that this was an important conversation to join. Not only do we want to raise the awareness of these invisible crimes, but we wanted to give leaders in this field a platform to share their experiences and to promote collaboration with each other and with you, our audience, to assist in what is truly a global effort to eradicate this pervasive assault on fundamental rights. Human trafficking affects the security of our nations, our immigration policies, and our economies, and it infringes on human rights. And that's why we should all be concerned. Security and defense are key areas of cooperation for Canada and the US. In our Consulate General here in Miami, for example, we have colleagues representing Canadian law enforcement, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Border Protection, Canadian Border Services Agency, and Immigration and Refugee Departments, the Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, in addition to our political, economic, and consular sections. This means that all our sections have files which touch on human trafficking in one way or another. Today's session will focus on human trafficking in the agricultural industry. The food that you and I eat comes from all corners of this world. Specifically, as we're talking Canada, Florida, and Georgia, Canada is the #1 market for agricultural products for both Florida and Georgia, with $1.4 billion of exports from Florida and $1.1 billion from Georgia, and over 600 million in exports from Canada into each state. What you grow in Florida and in Georgia, we eat in Canada, and what we grow in Canada, you eat in Florida and Georgia. By virtue of our trading relationship and our integrated economies, our food supply is inextricably linked. And therefore, we may all be complicit in problems in each other's countries, sometimes without even knowing it. Migrant workers are particularly vulnerable given their economic situations, their lack of language skills, and their lack of understanding of their rights in our respective countries. It's our duty to protect those who come to our countries and help build our business and economies. But it's not all bad news. Tremendous strides are being made by all levels of government, civil society, private industry, and individuals like you and me to counteract and put an end to these crimes. And there is significant progress being made. I'd like to now introduce you to leaders and trailblazers who are making a difference in eradicating these crimes and improving the lives of so many. We are honored to have as our moderator today, Shirley Cuillerrier, Canada's Special Advisor to Combat Human Trafficking. She is here to share the work of Government of Canada and the international community in combating human trafficking. Shirley's a retired Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer, a Mountie, and a member of the Mohawks of Kanesatake. She has previously led the RCMP's National Human Trafficking Coordination Center and has devoted much of her career to supporting women and children who are victims of domestic violence. She was also the senior advisor on reconciliation, and in this role had the responsibility for leading the RCMP's response to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She has received extensive recognition and has garnered numerous awards throughout her career for her work. And may I say, Shirley, it's a particular honor for me to be working with you today. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our distinguished panel of guests who will be introduced by Shirley in just a few moments. Deborah Richardson of the International Human Trafficking Institute of Atlanta, Georgia. Laura Gemino of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers from Immokalee, Florida, and Shelley Gilbert, Coordinator of Social Services, Legal Assistance of Windsor, from Windsor, Canada. I know that all of our experts have a wealth of information to share with you, and I hope that today's event will help lay the groundwork for future and expanded cross-border collaboration in the fight against human trafficking. Once again, thank you to all our panelists and to all of you for being here with us today. And without further ado, please let me turn you over to our moderator, Shirley Cuillerrier. Shirley?
Merci, and thank you, Madame Consul General, for the kind introduction. So I want to begin my remarks today by acknowledging the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe brothers and sisters, whose beautiful land I am allowed to live on, also known as Odawa in Algonquin language, but to many of you, known as Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Welcome et bienvenue today to our cross-border conversation on race, gender, and class, labor trafficking, and the food we eat. Thank you to the 130 people who have registered for this conversation from both sides of the border. As a special advisor to the Minister of Public Safety Canada, in support of Canada's national strategy to combat human trafficking, I recognize the importance of working with our partners across the border in partnership with civil society and non-government organizations to protect and empower victims of human trafficking and addressing their specific needs. Today, you will hear from 3 panelists who are doing just that, making a difference in the lives of many who find themselves as victims of human trafficking. It is my honor to introduce to you our 3 illustrious panelists. Starting with Laura Gemino. Laura is an internationally recognized expert on modern-day slavery. As the Anti-Slavery Program Director of the Coalition of the Immokalee Workers, she and her colleagues have uncovered, investigated, and assisted in the prosecution of many multi-state labor trafficking operations in the agriculture since the early 1990s, including the seminal slavery operation United States versus Flores, which helped lead to the initial passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. Ms. Germino also assisted in the creation of the CIW's Fair Food Program and the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Model, a breakthrough worker-driven approach to verifiable corporate responsibility and accountability recognized by observers from the United Nations to the White House for its unique effectiveness in combating and preventing forced labor, sexual violence, and other gross human rights violations in the workplace. Shelley Gilbert. Shelley is the chair of the Windsor-Essex Anti-Human Trafficking Action Group in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, providing support and advocacy to survivors of domestic and international human trafficking of forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and women trafficked into the sex industry. She has conducted training and workshops for both NGOs and law enforcement as to the identification and provision of service to survivors across the country. Ms. Gilbert has worked at the Legal Assistance of Windsor since 1993 and is currently coordinator of social work services. Deborah Richardson is a nationally recognized expert on social justice for women and girls and advocates to end human trafficking. Since 2019, she has led the advocacy efforts in public policy and services for sexually exploited girls. She coordinated campaigns to eradicate the facilitation of trafficking on online platforms, testified before Congress, and advised more than 30 communities throughout the United States, including Puerto Rico, on organizing and implementing their efforts to address child sexual exploitation. Ms. Richardson is currently the executive director of the International Human Trafficking Institute of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, leading a 3-year strategic plan to reduce human trafficking in Metro Atlanta. Welcome to our 3 panelists. Laura, Shelley, and Deborah, your work has allowed you to have a significant impact on the lives of trafficked people and their families. Will you each please share with us how each of you came to do this important work? Laura, can you start us off?
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this issue. I'm thinking about how long ago it was, which is, now our Fair Food Program is across the country in lots of states, and then also our investigations and prosecutions are covering, as you said, multi-state. But back in the early 90s, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was a worker-based organization that we did not set out to be an organization fighting labor trafficking. It was really, it's a town that's an agricultural town, a global crossroads, a very poor town, but also very cosmopolitan in the sense that migrant workers would come from Guatemala, Haiti, Mexico, and some from the US to harvest crops. And at that time, the labor conditions throughout the industry were degraded. It was a degraded labor environment with very low wages, very difficult working conditions. But we were fighting to bring an end to those conditions and to bring dignity to the work. What we didn't know was that there were workers being held against their will and not free to leave. The first one we encountered in the early 90s involved, we were doing just labor rights outreach to labor camps about your rights. And workers came to us saying, well, they had had to flee a camp in the middle of the night and were not able to get their last pay. And my colleagues and I asked, well, why did you have to leave in the middle of the night? And this group of workers said, well, because the boss shot a man who wanted to leave and go work elsewhere. And at that point, this was in the early 90s, there weren't the anti-trafficking units or this anti-trafficking movement really across the US and Canada and the world. And from there, it emerged that there was, crew leaders holding workers, 500 workers at a time against their will, with armed guards, beating and pistol whipping workers. This it merged into a multi-state case that was US versus Miguel Flores. But from that time, that wasn't the only case. So the labor trafficking operations continued to be uncovered by us in the course of our work. And it became very clear that it was not a one-time thing, but a systemic problem.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Shelley, how did you get involved in this work? You're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you also for having me here today. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm coming from as the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. So similar to how Laura was saying, our program back in 2002, when we started this in Windsor and Essex County, began looking at human trafficking really through the lens of international sex trafficking of women and girls. However, in 2007, a group of migrant workers originally from Mexico and Thailand came forward in our community, and they discussed really horrific living conditions, wage theft, intimidation, debt through recruitment fees, sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the workplace. And we really recognized what was happening and what this was as labor trafficking at that time. And so we began providing information, advocacy, counseling, access to legal services over the next 5 years with that particular group. When you think about the length of time that people required some level of support, as well as started uncovering this as more of a systemic issue as well. What we learned from these experts, the survivors in this matter, was a few things. One, the incredible courage, humility, and sense of justice that people came to our table and sort of taught us, I think, at that point, and helped us to understand what their circumstances were and had the real courage to speak to us about that. Secondly, that people experienced a whole range of violations and a whole range of exploitive tactics, and the impact that those strategies, that those violations were having on each of them. Some were common sort of types of impacts and some really different. We're going to talk, I think, some more about that today. And thirdly, that the system itself, that the program isolation and some of the program requirements really exacerbated some of the individual vulnerabilities, such as historical gender-based violence, language barriers, etc. And that it was those types of vulnerabilities, as well as the program vulnerabilities, that really came together and made the conditions really ripe for exploitation and labor trafficking to happen.
Thank you, Shelley. Deborah, how'd you get involved in this work?
Well, my story begins back in 1999 when I was the director of program development at Fulton County Juvenile Court. And my responsibility was to find services for all children who were coming through our court system. And that particular Monday morning, I was sitting in the back of the courtroom, and a 10-year-old little girl came in. She was handcuffed and shackled at the ankles. She had just spent 3 days in juvenile detention. She had been charged with curfew violation and child prostitution. However, the 42-year-old man that she had been found with, who had rented her for sex for 2 hours, was let go because pimping and pandering a child in was a misdemeanor. So that began to work. And there are some members on this chat today who are part of that initial coalition, like Stephanie Davis, where we really got together as women of Atlanta and says, we cannot allow this to happen to our girls. But Shelley, you brought in a very important piece, is the intersectionality in terms of how women and girls are exploited. And what we find is the exploitation presents itself in so many different ways, and it's a lot more complex than we once understood. And more recently, we have begun to think, what is the systemic response to this? And we truly are committed to providing awareness on consumer habits, as well as having law enforcement enforce the law, because exploitation of people is a felony throughout the United States and is a crime as well in Canada. However, those who are privileged, such as the owners of places, the farm workers, the people who are operating these industries where people are exploited, are often not punished. And as long as we allow that to happen, we will always be having conversations like this. So I like the way that the direction this conversation is going in terms of those systemic solutions.
Thank you, Deborah. Now, can each of you describe for us how labor trafficking occurs in the urban and suburban communities of your respective regions, particularly as it relates to the food that we eat? Deborah, can we start off with you?
Absolutely. So in outside of Atlanta, Georgia, north of the city, there is a number of poultry processing plants that take place. We understand we're the third state in producing poultry in the country, in the United States. And what we have found is
Deborah, you're on mute.
I need to start over. So north of Atlanta, there are a lot of poultry processing plants. Georgia's the third highest state of poultry plants. And what we found within those plants is a lot of horrific conditions. There is a lot of wage theft. There are workers having to work in untenable situations, very low temperatures, machines that don't have the proper safety hazards. They are given quotas. They are forced to work beyond the normal fair labor laws. And so all of this is happening, but it's unbeknownst to us, because when we walk into the store, we see a sanitized version of the product that's all packaged and not and nice, not realizing that people's lives have been lost, people have been injured, and families are living severe stress from the conditions in these poultry plants.
Thank you. Laura.
You know, the interesting thing when Deborah was talking about poultry plants, the Fair Food Program mechanisms that we use to prevent labor trafficking from happening, we actually have poultry groups talking to us now about replicating that. But back to your question, we work in an agricultural area, and the labor trafficking that goes on occurs. You might have an operation that's based in Florida, but then would be taking workers as well to work against their will in Georgia, the Carolinas, Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, New York, et cetera, coming back down. So because it is the migrant stream, and it's all about control, and it doesn't occur in a labor environment that does not tend to occur in a vacuum. In other words, in a humane, progressive workplace, it isn't really able to take root. It has to have fertile soil to take root, which would mean a workforce where already it's generally exploitative. And then at the end of this spectrum of violations, labor violations or mistreatment, is this crime of labor trafficking, and also in industries where sexual violence and sexual harassment are endemic, which was the case in agriculture. And it tends to be in these cases where workers incur a debt. Well, they're told it's a debt generally for transportation. And this can happen to workers who are here undocumented or here on guest worker visas. Their visas and passports tend to be taken from them, or even US citizens who are recruited, say, from homeless shelters in urban and suburban areas, and told that they can have a job and a roof over their heads if they get in the van and come work in a faraway agricultural operation in, say, North Florida or the Carolinas, to name a case that we had worked on. And then when you are in these labor trafficking operations, generally workers do not immediately know necessarily they're being held against their will. It's when they start to test, when they think, oh, I'm going to walk down the street, or I'm going to go to a meeting, or I'm going to go call my family. And then all of a sudden you start realizing that your housing, your job, your rides to and from work, your access to visitors, communication with family are all being controlled, and you are not free to communicate as you wish or leave as you wish. And it ends up being, it can occur in labor camps, of course, on isolated farms, which is understandable, but it can also occur right in town. So, in Lake Placid, Florida, workers were being held in a house that was right alongside a retirement community. And the retirement community people just didn't know, because people lived in these sort of parallel worlds. And the workers mostly spoke either Spanish or an indigenous Mayan language. And when the case came to light, those same retirees, mostly in the communities next door, had no idea.
Right. Well, thank you, Laura. And I know you, in your comments, you include US citizens, which, is not something we think about all the time. Shelley.
So just to put my community in a little bit of context, we have a large under glass farming community, one of the largest in the country, if not the largest in the country, under glass farming community. So we have around 8,000 to 10,000 authorized and undocumented workers here in our community. But I don't think that Windsor-Essex County is any different. I know it's not, from my partnerships and communication with colleagues across the country. So our community, I think, is really indicative of issues right across this country. And as we know, exploiters or traffickers prey on vulnerabilities. And most often the vulnerability used in labor trafficking is poverty. Because the opportunity to work, to feed your kids, to take care of your family, and here in Canada is thought to be a real gift. And it is for most of us. However, once here, as workers either with authorization to work or those without authorization to work, traffickers are able to exploit other vulnerabilities and other situations that the workers are in. Most often, these workers are already working in really difficult, dangerous conditions. They're living in dirty housing conditions on farms and even off property as well. So for workers with authorization, these conditions coupled with promises of a better situation make them vulnerable to further recruitment, pulling them into situations of illegality, of working without authorization, and often in worse working conditions, in worse living conditions, and under the complete control of their trafficker. For those individuals who come to Canada and who fall prey to the deception that they can have a work permit from within Canada, soon they learn that the work permit is not coming, that they are undocumented people, that they are illegal people, and they're subject to horrific living conditions, working conditions, wage theft, all of the things that we've spoken about. And it's at that point when they recognize that, as Laura was saying, that coercion strategies have to be implemented to keep them quiet, to keep them compliant, where there are perhaps threats made against family, where there are threats to go to the authorities and they will be arrested and deported, etc. So the coercions used to force compliance often involve derogatory statements, racially derogatory statements, sexual intimidation, those sort of things that contribute, unfortunately, for the victim to feel shame, feel guilt, feel like they've got to withdraw further. And when we couple that with fear of authorities, because we're undocumented people now, then it forces people further underground and their situation stays in a really untenable place.
Thank you, Shelley. I would like us to explore strategies now for eradicating the scourge of labor trafficking in our communities. And Laura, I'm wondering if you can speak to what consumers can do.
The interesting thing is that after multiple prosecutions that we helped bring, through uncovering workers and witnesses to these terrible crimes, and many of the crew leaders who were sent to jail, obviously, with some as long as 30-year sentences. But we became known as Florida, the area, as ground zero for modern day slavery. But why is that? Partly because we were bringing the cases to light, but and you don't know if in other areas that you could have that same level. But when you think about ground zero for modern day slavery, you think, well, after all these cases, other ones keep coming up. We have to get to the point of prevention, where we're not cleaning up the abuse after it's already happened, and where the men who've suffered beatings, shootings, pistol whippings, the women who've been suffered sexual violence while being held, we need to have that no longer happen to people. And when workers began bringing to the attention of consumers and ethical consumers, students were very important in this, student allies in campuses across the country. This was back in 2004, initially bringing to the attention of students, faith-based allies, ethical consumers of all walks of life, really, that workers in the 21st century were held in labor trafficking, and therefore when you were eating say a tomato in your taco or hamburger as a consumer, you did not know. This company could not guarantee to their consumers if you were eating something picked by workers held in labor trafficking.
Right.
How do we get past that point? And that began this campaign for fair food. Mm-hmm. The campaign for fair food was designed to bring not just to bring an end to exploitative labor conditions and to labor trafficking once and for all, since it's on the spectrum of crimes that happen to people when they're working in a toxic environment like that. Right. And as a result, because of consumers allying with workers, we now have a market-based enforcement system. It's called the Fair Food Program, where there's worker-driven education out on the farms. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a human rights organization, goes and educates workers on their rights and responsibilities, and workers become their own monitors of their rights. And then market-based enforcement is, with the Fair Food Program, we have the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, growers, and then the big buyers, who include McDonald's, Walmart, Burger King, Trader Joe's. I'm thinking of what would be the ones in Canada that would be familiar. Probably many of these companies, but 14 now at this point, who have agreed with written binding legal agreements that they will cease to buy from suppliers where slavery or modern day slavery or sexual violence is occurring in the supply chain. And so there's a whole way that we go about doing that. That we could get into more, but what it has resulted in is a virtual eradication of labor trafficking and sexual violence on Fair Food Program farms. And the change it's been truly transformative, but it is backed by it's powered by consumers in that sense. In the supermarket, there's a label, the Fair Food Program, the Fair Food label that you can see in Whole Foods, Fresh Market, and others, that is also really useful for consumers to know about it, because it was due to people from all walks of life caring and saying, I'm not going to be part of this. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. And we have seen a revolution. Really, the industry it's transformative what has happened.
Thank you, Laura. So, I mean, you're touching on the point about the power of the consumer, right? So, Shelley, can you speak to some of the gaps in regulations with law enforcement and prosecutions?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, with regards to those gaps, I think one of the biggest issues that we continue to have is that we have to admit that there is a problem of labor trafficking here in Canada. All levels of government, industry, civil society, NGOs, we have to accept the fact that labor trafficking is happening here. And I think if we do that, then we can begin to fix some of the laws and policies that create barriers and actually begin providing better protections. So, we have to look at things like the victim and trafficking in persons temporary resident permit and whether that is really effective, which most of us would say is not. We would have to look at the open work permit for vulnerable workers and include undocumented workers in those programs and policies. These temporary protections provide access for people for services. Obviously, it provides them status, but it also allows them access to services and helps people, if they choose to have the beginning of a pathway towards more permanent type protections. As part of the Canadian Council for Refugees, we've looked at a number of sort of legislative amendments that need to be in place, and those include even pathways for permanent protection for trafficked people. Having some sort of immigration class under the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, under IRPA for trafficked people, would reinforce a commitment, I think, to a human rights approach. So both the temporary and the permanent protections would mean that trafficked people would have effective access to justice. They would have access to healthcare, to education, and to psychosocial services to address trauma.
Right.
And Canada would really be able to sort of reinforce its efforts, I think, globally, to consider how we're contributing to displacement of people, to forced migration, and especially how it relates to Indigenous people and to women and girls.
Thank you, Shelley. Deborah, can you discuss how one reaches the gold standard in prevention?
Sure. And I want to extend on, Laura, your comments. It really does begin with the consumer. And we have to educate ourselves on where our food is coming from. For instance, 60% of cocoa beans is picked by child labor in West Africa. Those cocoa beans get processed into candy and is sold on our shelves. And because we are not aware of its source, we will choose candy based on a brand identity, not realizing that that brand, as a matter of fact, the most popular brands in the United States are the worst ones in terms of their exploitation of workers in Africa. There is a case that has been going on since Nestle for the past 14 years. It is now in the Supreme Court, and they've heard testimonies from hundreds of people when they were children being kidnapped, brought to these cocoa plantations and exploited. So we need to know the source of where that candy bar comes from and make a conscious decision that we're not going to support that. Same thing with seafood. A lot of the seafood that we purchase on our shelves have been harvested with labor trafficking. And it comes into the coastal process plant where it's processed and again put in a nice package and put a label on it, and we buy it without realizing that there has been a whole chain of sexual and exploited labor that's been used in the harvesting of that. And then finally, we need to be aware of all of our consumer projects. We're talking specifically about food, but there are over 177 products that are brought into the United States every year that were made with enslaved labor. We need to educate ourselves on what they are and not buy them. There are two amazing tools. One, the Food Empowerment Project out of the Immokalee Workers is an app that you can download on your phone. And when you go into the store, you put in the name of that candy bar, that brand, and it will let you know whether or not it's fair trade or not. And so right there and there, you can make that decision with that information. When you buy seafood, there's a label that on sustainable seafood products, whether it's, if it's at the fresh seafood counter, it would be up on the counter. We provide seafood from sustainable sources, or it's on a can, like with the can, like tuna, et cetera. That brand is on the can. If it doesn't have it, don't buy it. And then if we really want to shift the public perception of how this happens, there's an amazing website that calls slaveryfootprint.org, slaveryfootprint.org. You go into this on the site and it takes you throughout your house in terms of the electronics you have, the products, the cleaning products, the health, personal products you have, the food. And at the end, it will calculate for you how many people are enslaved to purchase those, the slave to produce those items that you have inside of your home. I recently did it with a family group, a multi-family group, and they were astounded. The particularly young people were totally appalled. You know, like one 14-year-old had 77 people enslaved for the products you have. The adults were up in the hundreds. But because we don't think about it, we make these choices, realizing that it's with our own dollars that we are investing and supporting this industry. So that's how we get to the gold standard. But as consumers, we do not allow it to happen in the first place.
Thank you for that, Deborah. And I think, you're speaking to that, like the use of technology, that, the education that needs to happen. And boy, the consumer can really have an impact on forced labor cases, right? Can each of you enlighten us to the impact of race, gender, and class on the issues in your respective communities? And Shelley, I'm wondering, can you talk specifically to the vulnerabilities that women face?
Sure. When I'm speaking with people, when I'm meeting with people, I'm meeting with people who have left their homes, their families, due to issues like gender-based violence, political conflict, and what that could lead to. I'm meeting with people who have lost the ability to farm their lands because of lack of resources now, and the loss of natural resources in their own land. And the most vulnerable as a result of those experiences are Indigenous people and women and children. So when exploitation and abuse happens here, we often see human rights violations like racist statements, the inability to practice your religion. We see sexual harassment and abuse. So women being forced into circumstances of sexual abuse in order to have their work permits extended, in order to keep their jobs here. And all of these, as Laura said, is really a means of all of these statements, the human rights violations, the sexual abuse, is all a means of exerting power and control over people. And so ultimately to be able to make more money from their work. So I don't think that we can ignore intersectionalities such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, immigration status. We can't ignore country of origin conditions that are forcing people to come here, forcing people to escape abuse in their country of origin, and how traffickers are using those vulnerabilities to exploit people further. Being a brown-skinned person, being a woman is not a vulnerability, but how the traffickers exploit that, how they use that against the person creates that vulnerability that lends to the trafficking of individuals in those circumstances.
Thank you, Shelley. Deborah, your thoughts?
I totally agree, Shelley, what you're saying. And then it extends down to the next generation, right? The children of women, the women who are being exploited, their children also exploited as well in exchange for they're being forced to have their daughters be abused, raped by the trafficker, whether it's the person over the crew or even the owner of the company themselves. And so it becomes an untenable situation that a woman particularly has to decide, am I going to go and risk being beaten or killed to protect my children, or do I stay here and allow it to happen over and over again? But it all comes back again to the fact that we have the laws on the books, but there's not the enforcement. There's not the emphasis on enforcement and doing these deep investigations. It wouldn't take long to look in terms of what is going on. For instance, with the poultry plant situation, if you've had several women been injured because of the machines and the repetitive, the kind of nature of the work they have to do and how it leaves them vulnerable to arthritis, even losing fingers, et cetera. If you keep having that happen all over again, where are the authorities that's looking into that when these people show up at the hospital or whatever? So it's all hidden in plain view. But because we feel that there's that vulnerable people, to your point, Shelley, Black and brown skin or women are not as valuable. They're not to be protected. So we allow that to happen. And so there's some complicit in all of our systems. And shame on us for not using our privilege and power to bring it up and to make sure that we're the voice for those who are vulnerable.
Laura, your thoughts?
Well, it's just so interesting what everyone has been saying. If you know that you talked about, I think Deborah was talking about the laws on the books. Very frustrating because it's both the laws, at least in the US, were very inadequate, very minimal, even if they were enforced. And then when they're not enforced, which they aren't, we had to look to do it another way. And that's why this is actually a private solution, market-based, and I'm to addressing those inequities, that power imbalance that came from, you know, we have a workforce in Immokalee where people are often, mostly from Mexico and Guatemala, many of indigenous origin. So we have 12 to 13 languages being spoken in town, Mayan languages. And so often Spanish is actually a second language, English a third. To the point of, even in COVID, and I bring this up, when we've had many people die from the coronavirus, and on their death certificates, it will be a Mayan who has died, and they're classified as white. So even in death, we have these issues of where your identity is even obscured then. And that's just an example to show what you're up against. Right. And when you are a woman farm worker from perhaps Mayan or from Haiti or from Mexico, you and at this point, let's see, when we started out, women were only 10% of the workforce, very vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual violence. That the community said we have to fight back. We have to find a solution. And how do we get the power to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of being, remember, poor and indigenous, Black or brown, and female for the women involved. And what we now see is a situation where workers, men and women, come to work feeling actually happy and able to assert their rights in the workplace. Nobody wanted to take it as a given that it would always had to be that way. You know, that yes, people came from countries where they might have had to leave due to political, due to death squads in the case of Guatemala, or brutal economic conditions. But that doesn't mean, when you have those, what they call sending country factors, that doesn't mean when you come to a country like the US or Canada, once you get here, there shouldn't be the factors in country that allow people to be held in modern day slavery or labor trafficked. Okay. And so that's on That's on these countries that are receiving, right? And I think that what we've seen is that you can take an industry that was one of the most regressive, and it took everybody. I'm saying this was a win-win-win for the workers, for the growers, for the buyers, and you can make it one of the most progressive.
Right.
And it's a solution that, and you talked about consumers, there are companies, I mentioned the companies who are on board, the corporations, the corporate buyers of produce. Well, Wendy's isn't on board. And so I think it was Deborah talking about choices or where you go to eat? Well, right there is an active consumer campaign.
Right there.
For Wendy's. And I don't know how many of those are in Canada, but if you can walk across the street and go to a different restaurant and tell them why, right there, we're working on spreading more, we're enabling more workers to get those protections that you can get on Fair Food Program farms. You know, and it could work in either country. It could work in Canada too.
Thank you, Laura. Brilliant way to I think, talk about, you know, the Fair Food Program and that, you know, again, the power of the consumer walking across the street, right? That can make all the difference. We could go on forever, but I'm mindful of time here, and I know there's a lot of questions coming from our guests. So I have one last question, and I need you to answer really quickly. You know, so what is the one thing you want everybody on this webinar to remember about the work that you do? Can I start with you, Shelley?
Yeah, am I on? Yeah, I think that the thing I want people to remember most is two things. One, that labor trafficking is happening here and that it's along a continuum and we have obligations to people. And they believe that our country is a just country. So we need to now respond to that in our resources, in our legislation, in our education, in actually do some work around what this should look like. How do we support people that are experiencing violence here? That's what I want them to know.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Shelley. Laura.
That labor trafficking is outrageous, but all the more outrageous in that it's preventable. We have a solution in agriculture, and that it's like having a vaccine or a cure to a disease. It just needs to be implemented, and that consumers, workers, we can make this happen, and that really for those corporations aren't involved, they, you know, I think the big question is why not?
Great, it is. Thank you. Deborah.
We can do something about this. It is the power of our money that's driving this. And if we will take the time to get educated and covenant with ourselves and our families that we will not fuel the exploitation with our dollars.
Thank you, panelists, for all the information that you shared and your experience. And now I will turn the program back to DeAndre Marshall, who has identified some audience questions from the chat box.
So thank you, Shirley, so much for facilitating this brilliant conversation. At this particular time, I have asked twice if there are questions in the group, and at this particular time, I don't have questions, basically statements where people were co-signing on what our guest had said during the presentation. So at this time, we would have one last question of our guest. If anyone has something else that you would like to add to what has already been said, if any of our guests would like to add to what has already been said before we leave this conversation, seeing that we don't have any questions at this time.
I have a statement that actually I think Kat Doa put into the chat box, and that is that we as consumers, we need to demand a fair wage. As citizens, as voters, people should be given a fair wage. I mean, the fact that people are even people who are not being exploited by labor in terms of physical duress, but who are working in these low-paying jobs, production jobs, for them not to receive a fair wage, for them to not have enough hours where they can make the wage to support their families. That is, again, a travesty, and that's a public policy issue that we can all do something about in terms of looking at the wages, benchmark it against what it costs to live in a community. For the city of Atlanta, for instance, it's an $18 should be what the minimum wage is in order to live above the poverty line. So we need to do our own assessments in our own municipalities and then see what that fair wage is and then demand that it happens. So that's the other way that we prevent people from being exploited by not being paid what they should in order to live.
Thank you, Deborah, for highlighting that conversation. At this time, Chaz has asked a conversation of anyone on the panel, but I think it's in the chat box. She was asking about the different apps for fair trade or fair food items. We did give a couple of them in the chat box. Chaz, did anyone want to answer that directly?
I would love for people to explore fairfoodprogram.org because that will get you to where who our participating buyers are. And a lot of them are very large corporate buyers where you can be assured that not that a crime might never happen, but that if it were, there are multiple ways of making a complaint. You're prohibited from being retaliated against as a worker. And then there's immediate complaint, remedial mechanism to fix the problem. And it's just really, it would be great if people could explore it more. And I wanted to say that it's key that workers drive this. And that would be workers who normally, that people who have long been marginalized are now in the driver's seat with what we call worker-driven social responsibility, which is the model that the Fair Food Program is the most, is a very good and tested example of that.
Yeah. And I have to say, of course, I did a deep dive back into fair foods because I'm fascinated with this. And I looked at this before as well years ago. And I think, now Canada, I think, is in a different place than maybe when I looked at this 10 years ago. And there are opportunities for us to look at. For instance, the code of conduct goes beyond the minimum requirements, the legislative requirements, right? There is no reason why we can't expect to be better than the bare minimum, right? And demand industry be better than that. And I think we really have to look at that as consumers, as people in that are using these goods. What are our expectations of industry? And industry, the legislative requirement is your bare minimum. It's not what you're trying to achieve. And those are some of the really interesting concepts I think that we can pull from the Fair Foods project.
And the Fair Food Program, I think I didn't even bring this out because we've been talking about so much wonderful stuff, but the workers themselves develop the code of conduct. Think about how many times a corporation has said, this is our code of conduct. Well, do they know what needs to be fixed in the workplace or how what the suffering is and what the reason is behind these supposed protections they've developed? No, you have to have the person who's actually most affected writing up that code of conduct. It makes all the difference in the world. And then actually educating their peers about it.
Yeah. So we could definitely go on and on about this subject. It's such an interesting place to be. But the thing that we want to do at this point is, on behalf of the International Human Trafficking Institute and all of our collaborative partners, thank all of our guests, our participants who zoomed in today for this hour to spend this time with us to learn about fair food and what is happening not only in the United States, but also in Canada. We thank you all so much. To our panelists, our moderator, and the Consul General, Susan Harper, we thank you for being in our space today. May you all be encouraged. This is just my going forward to continue doing the work that you are doing with excellence William Wilberforce penned these words, and I will leave you with this to the people who are participants today. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. So thank you so much. Thank you to Ashanti Infantry, who's behind the scenes. Thank you for helping to facilitate this conversation. We wish you all a great day. We wish you all to be well. We wish you all to stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks,
I
everyone.
know.
Look forward to continuing to collaborate with everybody.
Same here.
Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, take care. Bye, all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.